This is Top Landing Gear.
Cleared for takeoff.
Pull up. Pull up. Pull up.
Hello and welcome to Top Landing Gear and our full flaps interview with Chris Parry, a Royal Navy observer on HMS Antrim's Wessex 3 known as Humphrey. Well, Chris is a fascinating character, and some of the stories he tells us here about what went on down south during the Falklands Conflict 40 years ago defy belief, not least the insertion and rescue of an SAS party on the Fortuna Glacier on South Georgia in the most unbelievably treacherous conditions. The fact that Chris also fired the first shots of the war to disable the Argentine submarine the Santa Fe is almost a footnote. The interview is full of the most incredible anecdotes, and it's also fascinating to hear Chris's thoughts on the current state of the British military 40 years on, and his views on the developing situation in Russia. We recorded Chris's interview on April the 20th, 2022, 40 years to the day since he and the crew of Humphrey were briefed for that extraordinary operation involving the SAS, which would take place just hours later. Hold on to your hats and settle in for an utterly riveting ride. So we're just delighted to be joined by Chris Parry, who my brother and I have actually met before many, many moons ago when you'd just come back from the Falklands, Chris, because you were married to my godfather's daughter. We do like to keep things in the family in this podcast. But you remember meeting us, which is, I think, even better, even more exciting, because you had a story to tell, which we're going to ask you about now, which is your time in the Falklands. But Chris, first of all, when you were training in the Gibraltar training area in Antrim, which was your ship, when it was all beginning to kick off in the Falklands, what were your thoughts and those around you in the Navy when you were tasked to go down south? What did you think was going to happen?
Well, on the 2nd of April, when it was confirmed that Argentina had invaded, essentially what happened was a number of ships were detailed off to go south. And in my ship, we thought, well, maybe we're not going to go. They'll send a couple of frigates, a destroyer and an oiler down there, perhaps the nuclear submarine, but the rest of us will go home for Easter. And we're all pretty surprised when everybody turned south, except for the ships that were really clapped out. And those that were clapped out were emptied of all their stores and ammunition. We went alongside Ariadne, and we emptied her of ammunition, torpedoes, stores, and everything. And we were doing vertical replenishment on the flight deck aft. And we were carrying shells in underslung loads as if peacetime didn't exist. It's quite extraordinary. Torpedoes on strops instead of in their sort of carrying sort of trolleys. And we ended up in a ship that had all its major passageways 2 crates thick of tins. We're actually walking on tins for the next sort of 2 weeks.
Well, this is food supplies.
Well stored.
Yeah.
So we headed off south, and so did most of the other ships from the spring train group. And we started thinking, okay, well, maybe this is going to happen. Maybe it's a show of force. I always say to people, after 40 years, I always get very skeptical when people say, oh, yeah, we knew we were sailing to war. That wasn't the case. We thought we were going down. We wouldn't actually get into combat. The Argentinians would go, yeah, we get it. You're on your way. And they'd leave. And right up till, let's see, it's the 20th of April today. I'd say right up until even tomorrow, the 21st of April, when we're off South Georgia, we still didn't think there was going to be a fighting war. It was only when, obviously, we got into action at South Georgia that things started. But if anybody says to you they knew they were going to war when they left the UK or the Gibraltar exercise areas, they're fibbing.
Did you get there ahead of the main fleet? Or did the whole fleet arrive together?
It was slightly complicated because in Antrim we had Admiral Woodward, who became the task force commander, he transferred very quickly to Glamorgan, and Antrim was detailed off to be the lead for a small group that consisted of Antrim herself, Plymouth, Tidespring and Euler, M Company Royal Marines, and we were detailed off to go and recapture South Georgia. And we went silently on radar and most of our communications all the way from Gibraltar on the 2nd of April via Ascension. And in fact, we arrived off South Georgia yesterday, 19th of April, 40 years ago.
Goodness me. So you were there as an observer on the Wessex 3, which is known as Humphrey. So the role of the observer in the Wessex was what exactly, Chris?
Well, I always used to say to people that the observer actually fights the aircraft, the pilots fly it. And essentially that's the case. If you think of a Wessex 3 or even a Sea King in those days, essentially being a London cab with a couple of cab drivers in the front. In the back, you've got all the electronics, you've got the sensors, you've got the weapons, and you've got an air crewman, an observer. And the observer essentially is an airborne warfare officer, and he's there. He fights the aircraft, as I said, and you ask the pilots in between them taking bananas off the dispenser to fly the aircraft where you want it to go. And predominantly it was an anti-submarine aircraft. We had a sonar on the end of a piece of electric wire that was 235 feet long. We had a fairly good radar for over the sea, not great over the land. And we had the communications and torpedoes, depth charges, machine guns, lots of toys.
How were the torpedoes launched? Were they held underneath the aircraft and they went from there, or was there a more Heath Robinson method than that?
No, there were carriers on either side of the aircraft that were fitted when you wanted to have munitions on the side. And obviously they were programmable in a very analog sense for sort of depth and setting and all that sort of thing. And you carried them externally. And you could do the same with the depth charges as well.
So, Chris, in terms of the layout then inside the cabin of the Wessex 3, it was very different from the Wessex 5. I want to make this distinction because that becomes very pertinent in the story about the Fortuna Glacier. So, whereas the Wessex 5s were used as troop carriers, they could carry how many?
Well, I think that they had about sort of 20 seats. Whether you could lift 20 people or not would be debatable, but they had about...
I think 6 to 10 in full load, 15 in light load in a Wessex 5, I would think.
Yeah. Right, but your Humphrey, the Wessex 3, the cabin was full of electronics and obviously the space taken up by the sonar. So how many people would you comfortably be flying in the back of the Wessex 3?
In addition to the 4-man crew, probably 2 or 3.
Yeah.
And they'd be standing.
Yeah. But you were actually asked, I think, on the way down to South Georgia to remove the sonar from Humphrey. Is that right?
Yeah, the Admiral, who was a submariner, of course, decided he wanted all his helicopters for load lifting and for taking troops around. And we complained vociferously about this. And we managed to sneakily keep the radar in. And happily we did, because actually we used that for surface search, for targeting, all the other sorts of things we needed to do. But I tipped off my chief mechanician saying, look, you may need to put this back pretty quickly. Now, let me tell you, it had never been done before at sea. So he was spotting up in his sort of his Haynes manual to make sure he could do it. And so Chief McKee, my hat goes off to him, because when we had to put it in, he put it in less than 18 hours, and the first time we pinged, it worked. So He did a great job.
In hideous weather conditions.
Yeah, it's South Georgia is an interesting place. I always say, and I said in my book, you get 4 seasons in the same day there. And looking back on my diary today, 20th of April, while we were sitting off waiting to put the SCS on the ground, we had a force 6 from the northwest. So that's winds of upwards of 40 knots, and that's on a nice day. So it's lumpy off South Georgia. The wind and the weather comes straight off Antarctica, And the first thing it hits is South Georgia, and you get all the turbulence and friction associated with wind when it hits an obstruction. Catabatics, anabatic winds, a lot of fog, and a lot of snow.
Yeah, and that again is a relevant factor, the snow and the fog, because it was totally reliant on you as the navigator, if I may use that term.
No, you may not.
Right, as the observer with a radar. Is that right?
Observer doing, shall we say, navigation on a chart that was made in 1950. Most of the features were about 3 miles out, and I have to tell you, the only time I've ever used a stopwatch and the dead reckoning to actually get through some fairly interesting gaps in the cloud and in mountains, actually. Yeah.
Astonishing. I mean, people have to read your book, which I've checked on Amazon is available in paperback. It's called Down South, and it is there it is. We can see, Chris, of course, it's, yeah.
And if you can get hold of a hardback, they are really rare. And
I've got it right here.
Yeah, they're selling for over £100 at the moment.
Fantastic.
So
would you like to buy mine, Chris?
It's signed by Rob Curling.
If it's signed, they're only worth about 20 quid.
But it's brilliant because that is a diary that you wrote pretty much on a daily basis, give or take. So it's, very much of the moment without any sort of use of hindsight. So it's absolutely fascinating. You really get the feel of just what was going on out there. So, Chris, this Fortuna Glacier, the insertion of the SAS onto the Fortuna Glacier, can you just take us through that from the beginning? Because they were absolutely sure that this was what they wanted. This is the way they wanted to go in at South Georgia, and you all queried that this seemed a very strange way to want to insert onto South Georgia.
Well, interesting enough, Rob, it's the 20th of April today, and this was the day the discussion was had, to tell you the truth. One of the strange things about the SAS is people won't remember this, but most people in the armed forces in 1982 really didn't know what the SAS did. Yeah. They sort of knew they'd done the Iranian embassy siege 18 months before. They knew they worked in Northern Ireland and did all sorts of things there. But when they came on board off Ascension, they sort of tucked themselves away and really didn't discuss anything with us. And they first appeared 40 years ago today and said, here's our plan. We want to go up on this glacier. And Stuart Cooper, who was my second pilot, said, well, why do you want to do that? And they said, well, they won't expect us to come from that direction. and he then said, and he was a Dewar Scott, and he said, but they won't expect you to come by Polaris missile either. But that's no good reason to do it. And I can remember, even now, the looks from these SAS guys that could have melted steel at 10 feet, I'd say, at that point. And we said, look, have you heard about catabatic winds? Obviously, they hadn't. Have you heard about icing? Have you done this? No. We want to go here. They then got onto their satellite phone back to Hereford, who got onto, I think, Downing Street, and the message came back, do as you're told. God. And we were going to do it anyway. The Fleet Air Arm tends to sort of say, yeah, we're a can-do outfit, we'll go and do it. And we said, but before we do it tomorrow, we'd like to take you, the Major, Cedric Delves, up on the glacier and see what it's like.
Yeah. May that have changed things somewhat, you think?
Well, no, it didn't, because what we did is we took him up there and had a bit of a struggle getting up there with his head of his mountain and Arctic warfare cadre guy, John Hamilton. Yeah. And they were looking at it, and we were looking at it, and it was pretty nasty. Big winds, lots of snow, catabatics, obviously, and mountains. And we're in and out of cloud and mountains and all that sort of thing. And it wasn't nice, there's no doubt about it. And the worst part of it was there was real crevicing on the glacier. And on the private intercom, we're going, how are you going to cross that then? And the SAS guy's going, oh, it's a bit challenging. Yeah, a bit challenging. But Shackleton did this across this glacier, I heard them say. And I'm thinking, this is going. And then Cedric said to John Hamilton, you've got to get on, John.
Really?
And John said, okay, we'll do it. So we went back down again, and Ian, flight commander, Stuart and myself are going, they can't be serious about this. But we got back to the ship, and they said, right, let's mount up, let's do it.
That phrase, "you've got to get on, John," became open to all sorts of interpretation, didn't it? I remember reading.
That's what Cedric says. Yeah.
Oh, right.
John unfortunately got killed in West Falklands, so he's not around to tell us. But it seemed to me that he was saying to him, "You've got to get on the island." Yeah. Whether he was saying you've got to get on to the glacier, I wasn't sure. But we ended up having to go up there, so everybody seemed to think that's what was meant. I love Cedric, by the way; he's brilliant. We joke about this now because we both survived, but it's but it was interesting. Yeah, we were amazed they were going to do it, and not just because of the weather and the conditions and things like that. It was really hostile, no question. And let's not forget -20 as well.
Yeah. So flying conditions horrendous. So it was you in the single engine Wessex 3 and 2 Wessex 5s, which would be twin engine, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
Taking how many troops between the three of you?
Well, we had 16 4x4-man teams. The Wessex 5s took, I think, they took 6 each with their kit, and we took 4, standing room only in the back of us. I mean, the interesting thing was at the first approach, and I got some great pictures. The edge of the glacier is about 1,000 feet high. Completely shrouded in cloud. We had a go at getting up on the glacier, but in the end, it was just too windy. And I said to people, as soon as you enter cloud below the level of mountains, your bottom starts to squeak a bit. Yeah. You should be at the safety altitude, but your icing problems are too great then. And I always say to people that flying on Fortuna was very much like flying down the streets of Manhattan in thick fog. That's what it was like. So the first 2 attempts, we failed to get very far up the glacier before it got really dangerous. We ran out of tail rotor control on one of those runs. So we put the Wessex 5s down on a spit of land.
Was that due to wind? Was that due to wind, Chris?
No, we essentially got into a funneling. We couldn't see it, but we got into a funneling effect down one of the mountains. It was katabatic wind that was funneled by the shape of the mountain, and it just took us from astern, actually, and the tail rotor just went, we'll stall, I think. And we just lost it. And we started, counter-rotating. Yeah. We had about 6 spins, I think, and then we got out of it. I think Ian put the nose down and away we went. It was fine, but interesting. But we then went back to the Wessex 5s and said, look, we're going to refuel. Went back and refueled and said, if the weather's okay. And, we got a bit of a clearance then, got them up on the glacier, and it was challenging still, but it was clearer at that point. And then landed them, took off, went back to the ship. Thank God for that. And then we had a Force 11 come through that night, which, if it were in the tropics, would be called a hurricane, I think. Yeah. The aircraft stayed out on deck, and we thought the following day that the aircraft would be absolutely trashed, but it wasn't. And we had waves, higher than the mainmast at one stage. Quite entertaining. In fact, people were invited up onto the bridge to witness it overnight because the captain thought everybody could tell their grandchildren about it. He was trying to keep morale up. And then the following morning at breakfast, which was basically not at the table at all because you had to grip on the food and the drinks because it was so rough. Cedric came in and said, we've got a bit of a problem. And we said, who do you mean by we? And he said, this is the problem. The guys are dying up on the glacier. We've got to go and get them. And we thought, oh, yippee, great. Anyway, the aircraft was okay. We did a quick test flight, took the Wessex 5s with different pilots today, by the way, on the Wessex 5s. That was interesting.
Yeah, okay.
So Mike Tidney and Georgeson hadn't flown the previous day. So that was the first time they'd seen the conditions. Once again, we had a few problems getting up on the glacier, the 2 Wessex 5s following us. The radar didn't help because it wasn't great over land. all it did do was give me an indication from the previous day of where some of the big obstructions were.
Yeah.
But I was trying to work that out on the chart and also use my stopwatch on legs that, frankly, I wasn't confident about. But the pilots believed me, so that was fine.
So, Chris, just to go back a little bit, sorry, just in the Wessex 3, where are you sitting as an observer? Are you up front, or are you?
No,
you're
sitting in the dark
cabin?
in the back.
Right.
Yeah, it's you're sitting about, I suppose, 8 feet in front of where the tail pylon starts.
Yeah.
You're in the dark. You're behind the sonar and the radar and things like that. But you're on the lower part of the Wessex.
And the pilot's upstairs on his own.
2 of them. We always
two
flew as a 4-man crew.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So 2 pilots.
You needed those extra pair of eyes. You got the crewman in the sonar operator seat, but on this occasion he was sitting in an open door.
Yeah.
But I have to say, totally iced up. And he said, "It's getting really cold here, boss." I said, "Come on, you've got a goon suit on." And so eventually, the long and the short of it was that similar conditions the previous day, we managed to get up to where the guys were. All 3 of us landed, and we implaned the guys. And Mike Tidd in one of the Wessex 5 said, "I think I can see a gap. Will you let me go?" And I must confess, I said to the boss, I said, "We don't want to do that, boss. If he loses us, the last thing we want to do is be transiting down there in cloud and we don't know where another Wessex is."
And you were basically responsible for them as the only radar for guiding them anyway, Chris, is that right?
It wasn't really that, Rob.
No.
The radar wasn't much help, to tell you the truth. What it was giving me was some indication of where we were on the ground relative to the features around. But it's not a terrain radar. It's designed for picking up submarine periscopes and things like that.
Okay.
Very basic centimetric radar. I can't tell people how bad it was over land. And the other problem is the radar sits behind the main gearbox. So you've got a 15-degree blind dark ahead of you.
Yeah.
So you can't actually see what you're running towards.
Great design.
So it's not designed. I was doing most of it on dead reckoning, navigation, and timings, to tell you the truth. But the point was that if you've got an observer doing the navigation, the pilots are not having to worry about the housekeeping and the navigation and all the other stuff and the communications. They just get on with flying the aircraft, whether it's in cloud or in anything else. One thing we had in the Wessex 3, the Wessex 5 didn't have, was the auto hover that we had for hovering above the sonar when we were doing anti-submarine work.
Yeah.
If you really, really got into trouble, you could bring it into a controlled hover where the aircraft itself would hold you steady.
Yeah.
And a number of times we were disorientated, so we just brought the thing into a hover and just held it there. The only snag with that is, of course, with crevicing, the radalt thinks you're higher than you are and forces you down onto the glacier.
Oh my goodness!
So there's some interesting ergonomics there. But the fact of life is, I'd like to think that the fact we had an observer meant the pilots didn't have to do all their own worrying, whereas I think Ian Georgeson and Mike Tidd did have to do that.
Yeah.
Anyway, Mike Tidd was given permission to take off, and within about, I suppose, 30 seconds of transitioning, he just totally lost orientation, went straight into a snow squall. They say in all the secondary books it was whiteout. It wasn't whiteout. It wasn't recirculating snow. It was a fairly blinding snowstorm, and he basically stoofed in on his side. And we thought, oh no, here we go. And so the other Wessex 5 and ourselves, we taxied over to the aircraft, expecting there to be some serious casualties. As it happened, they all came out of it, cuts and bruises only, I think. And we divided essentially the crew and the SAS guys between us. And we were quite heavy for us. Ian obviously took a few more. And we started off down the glacier. And we said to Ian, make sure you don't lose sight of us, as we go down. But we're in and out of cloud, snowstorms. There's one occasion where we flared right in front of a mountain that we just couldn't see. The big problem was we had to do a sort of zigzag up through the mountains. It wasn't a straight ascent. So, it was a bit challenging. And we got to the glacier edge just before we got into Fortuna Bay. And Stuart was looking at the Wessex 5 in his mirror, and he stooped in. Sure enough, what had happened is that Ian had been so concentrating on our tail light, I think, is what he said afterwards, that he didn't notice actually the white of a ridge actually was sort of merging with the sort of snow and the cloud in front of him. We had gone over the ridge higher actually. He came in a bit lower and struck the ridge, and again crashed. Now, Ian, at that point, my flight commander said, "Right, we've got to go around and get him." I said, "Boss, we can't. We're heavy, and frankly, we've got to get back to the ship and get these guys who are pretty shocked off the ship, off to the ship." So we went back to the ship, refueled, came back with medical supplies, blankets, tried to raise them actually on radio, nothing. And the weather was really, really bad, as bad as it had been. So we went back to the ship, and this is probably about 1 o'clock. And the weather didn't really get any better until about 4:30, when I say better, it's better than it was. And we then came up with this plan that what we would do is we'd risk icing and go high this time, above whatever was going on, to 5,000 feet, and look down. And it was the last sortie really before sunset, and we think they might have been in trouble if they'd stayed. So we took the aircraft up to 5,000 feet above the glacier, and I can tell you the whole of the front of the aircraft was iced. Even the pitot tube was iced.
Wow. So from what I remember from the Wessex, it was actually generally was quite robust against icing, although it had no anti-icing features. If you went through a bit of ice, it was generally okay. But
yeah, what was concerning us, to tell you the truth, was the ice that was breaking off.
Jesus Christ!
Which was, to see that flying past the window was something that the air crewman wasn't really happy with. And I said, "But you can't catch any." But anyway, but bizarrely, we got up on top and we looked down through a gap and we could see an orange life raft.
Right.
And sure enough, it was the guys. They put a life raft up to keep themselves warm, of course, on the glacier. And we went down, and it was classic Sucker's Gap, because as soon as we went through the gap, of course, it closed up. And so we sort of paused at it must have been about 800 feet above the glacier. And what we did was we wound down in 50 feet steps on the flight control system. Mm-hmm. Just hoping that we wouldn't smash into the glacier. But anyway, it cleared at about 200 feet above the glacier, and we landed. And the SAS guys were okay, so were the crew, but there were 16 of them. So that basically makes us a ton overweight. Yeah. And we piled everybody in the back. We had to take their weapons off them. The guys wanted to take their armor lights. We let them take their armor lights because they had them in Northern Ireland, but everything else had to stay. Yeah. And some of them were quite resistant. And Fitz said, "Look, this is the last train down the mountain. If you don't catch this one, you're not making it." So they left their stuff, and we had a bit of a problem because we couldn't lift. Yeah. We were so heavy. And in the end, we had to wait for an 80-knot gust of wind. And we got a fairly strong 70, 80 knot, and we staggered into the air. I mean, I've never heard a gearbox over talking, but it certainly was. Yeah. We got airborne, bit of a struggle to get down through the mountains again, obviously, but got out to sea, happy, and then we then realised that we probably wouldn't be able to hover alongside the ship. So, because normally what you do is you hover alongside the ship and move over, land on lashings to your medals. But it was going to have to be a different plan. So we got the ship to get on a course that gave us a green 30 wind, which is basically 30 degrees on the starboard bow. And we were going to do an offset approach straight in. So we had to basically come in and do a controlled, almost a running landing. Yeah. Because if you'd done it with brakes on, you'd have just tipped over. And basically, there was a silent understanding that if we messed it up, we'd go over the side on the starboard side rather than smash into the ship.
Yeah.
And that's what we did. We came in low, and Ian beautifully brought it in, controlled crash, undercarriage, very robust, as you said. And we were static, and we got the lashings on, and that was it.
How much room do you think you had across the ship to land, to do the running landing in?
Well, we put it on port side, 12 feet.
Oh, and presumably that deck was moving up and down a bit as well if the weather conditions were that bad.
Yeah. Don't want to make it too easy for the pilots.
But Chris, what was the reaction after that? The SAS guys very much up until that point had kept themselves to themselves, hadn't they? After that event, they must have been eternally grateful to you guys.
Well, yeah, and then they decided they wanted to go in by boat. Having trashed two of their helicopters, they decided they want to go in by boat. And they convinced the captain that very night to take the ship close inshore. You know, we're not going to expect them from this direction again. Very close inshore relief, and to put 5 Gemini inflatables over the side. Now, we were only about probably less than a kilometre away from the Argentine positions, and we went in really quiet and silent. And you got a 6,000-ton warship sitting off the Argentine positions. And this is after, as you know, the Royal Marines had to go at an Argentinian corvette, the Guerrico, when they'd invaded. So the captain wasn't really happy. But anyway, the other lesson we learned from this is if you take 5 Gemini engines from the nice warm ship and you put it into freezing conditions outside, they tend not to work. And so while we were sitting off the Argentine positions, all you could hear were these demented lawnmowers trying to start. The long and the short of it is that they managed to get 3 going, and they said they'd tow the other 2. And that's what they did. And we very gratefully went back out to sea again. And then again, the following morning at breakfast, in comes Cedric Dulles, and guess what the line was?
We've got a bit of a problem.
We've got a problem.
Didn't they lose a couple of guys in the Gemini for a few days out to sea?
Well, no, what happened was two of the Geminis hadn't made it, and they couldn't locate them. So we had to go off and look for them. And so I worked out what the tide and the wind was going to do. And we started a sort of square search about 30 to 40 miles offshore to the northeast. And we didn't find anything. And with about half an hour's endurance to go, I said, well, let's extend it downwind of it because it could have been worse than we thought. And at 62 miles off South Georgia, we found one of these Geminis with 3 Yetis in it. And we got them inboard and took them back. And they were on their way to South Africa. There's no question about it. And, the other Gemini made landfall and just had a duff radio. They found out later. But these guys were very lucky indeed. Yeah.
Goodness me.
You were searching for them in the aircraft that you'd just overstressed the gearbox for, that in peacetime would have been probably scrapped at that stage.
Yeah, do you want to live forever?
Well, a little bit longer than 23 or whatever you were at the time.
Yes.
Yeah, but you know what it's like in your 20s. You know, you're invincible, aren't you?
Yeah.
Oh. You eventually later on, Chris, I think I'm right in saying that the SAS guys who were still with you on Antrim were then transferred to another ship. And at that time, I think Cedric Dulles wrote a letter both to your captain and indeed to the flight to praise you, quite rightly, for everything you had done.
Yeah, he's a good bloke.
Well, it got you a mention in dispatches, didn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, quite right too.
I've got my flight commander a DSO, so yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the submarine turned up.
Well, yeah, tell us about that, because there was an idea that something was around, and you had to persuade your captain, didn't you, to let you launch in Humphrey and go searching. Now, had Humphrey got his sonar back in by this stage? No, still no sonar.
Yeah, what happened? Now we're talking about the 23rd. Now, one of the things that used to happen on board warships is that you used to get fairly high-grade intelligence, but it was only accessible to people who had developed vetting, and that was probably only about 4 of the officers. Now, there are indications from GCHQ that I now know about that a submarine might have sailed from Mar del Plata, the Santa Fe. But what really alerted us, we picked up a teletype message that was on high-frequency radio. And in the South Atlantic, that can only come from probably a warship or a submarine. And we're pretty sure there weren't any Argentinian warships around. And so, essentially, there's a very good book by Edward Young called One of Our Submarines from World War II. And if you want to fight submarines, it's a really good book to read because it tells you how they think. Anyway, we started talking about the fact that he couldn't possibly be over in South Georgia reacting to us because he would have had to sail, 8-9 days before. So he's obviously over here for another mission, and that was probably resupplying the garrison, perhaps even bringing more troops, fuel, ammunition, things like that, which is what he was, in fact. Now, the captain's immediate reaction was to take all the ships out to 200 miles outside the exclusion zone. Now, that was really because we didn't have the rules of engagement at that stage to engage anything. And we really didn't fancy taking the first shot from the submarine. We also had Argentinian Hercules and 707s flying around looking at us from distance, outside engagement range, but still looking at us. So they knew we were there. So in the end, I was quite pugnacious in those days. And I said to the captain, we really should be going after this thing. We're pretty invulnerable in a helicopter. Let us go and look for him. And in the meantime, I surreptitiously told my maintainer to put the sonar back in again. Yeah. And so in the end, long and the short of it is that there's a lot of faffing around about should we go on? No, we can't while the submarine's around. And I said to the captain, look, it's pretty obvious to me he's going to go in basically just before dark because we've got icebergs and things like that around. And he'll deliver his stores and then he'll come out, I think, before sun up the following morning on the surface. Because you've got these icebergs, ice flows and things like that. You don't want to run into those underwater. So I said, look, why don't you let us go in, have a look for him. I'll take a couple of depth charges. And if I find him, I'll rattle him. And then we had a problem with the rules of engagement. But what we managed to do was convince Whitehall that the combination of the surveillance aircraft and the submarine meant that they were up to no good. Well, we didn't know that, but it convinced them. And we had the rules of engagement to engage. So together with that, the captain said, okay, we'll go into 80 miles and you can go in and have a look for him. We also put a lynx up from HMS Brilliant that had joined the previous night. He had a torpedo just in case. And we also had 3 Wasps, 2 from Endurance that was pooling around, 1 from Plymouth with AS-12 anti-surface missiles in case actually there was interference by Argentinian surface ships, but also could be used against a surface submarine, sort of. But that was the issue. So at about 8 on the 25th, we took off. We transited in. The weather was awful, as usual. Didn't transmit on radio or radar, so we wouldn't alert him. DR navigation again. And arrived over Cumberland Bay, which is this huge bay in which Grytviken exists. Probably the finest natural harbour in the South Atlantic, by the way. And basically lots of icebergs around, lots of bergy bits, and about half a mile viz. So we couldn't see anything. Now, I said to Ian at this point, if I give one sweep on my radar, all he's going to hear is bzz. Now, that could be spurious. If you hear bzz, bzz, you know that's a radar. So it has to be one blip. Now, essentially, the radar goes around once every second, and the actual image on the radar is only there for about 5 seconds before it fades. Yeah. So one had to be quite agile. Now, what I've been doing the previous days is I've been actually calling some of these icebergs by name. So I designated them both various English kings. So I had Edward I and Richard II and all sorts of things. So I knew roughly where the icebergs had been, and they didn't move much. So I did my one sweep on the radar, and right next to Edward III, remember it distinctly, there was I could have called it the Black Prince, but that's being pretentious. But right next to Edward III was one that I didn't recognise. I hadn't designated. So I said, look, it's about 5 miles away. Should we go and have a look? And we went and had a look. And sure enough, it was a submarine. God. He was just going down, fin above the surface, masts up. And then Ian said, I suppose it could be Conqueror, because Conqueror had been designated to come and screen us to the northwest. And I remember distinctly saying, it's a submarine, he's getting it. I don't care. But I had a look at it, and it was definitely a conventional, and we didn't have any conventionals around at that time. So worked out the ballistic throw, ran in, over the top, 2 depth charges, both went alongside him, blew his back end out a bit. He yawed to port, and you could see oil coming out the back end, a lot of air as well. He'd actually split a ballast tank and a fuel tank. He came sort of frothing to the surface. And what was really irritating is that Stuart Cooper always carried a camera, but that morning when we manned up, he'd split the seal on his goon suit. So he changed into his other goon suit, and of course forgot to transfer the camera.
Oh no!
So as Ian did the sort of wing over, near victory roll, we said, get the shot. And Stuart said, I haven't got my camera.
Oh, no.
And Chris, am I right in saying, and this may be quite wrong, that was the first attack on a submarine anywhere in the world since the Second World War?
Yeah, the Pakistanis lost a submarine, but it lost it on its own mine when it was trying to lay mines in the Indian Pakistan.
That one doesn't count.
In 1971, it was the first attack, by an aircraft since 1945. First attack by a helicopter. That's the point.
Ever. Yeah.
And do you know what happened? Did it surface and limped back on the surface?
No, it basically was sinking by the stern. That was its real problem. Its starboard engine was still going okay. He went back on the surface. He was well below. What we did, because we didn't know what condition he was in, we didn't want him to dive. So what we did was we dropped the Mark 46 torpedo underneath him to dissuade him from diving, because Mark 46 doesn't attack surface ships. Yeah. And in fact, the captain afterwards said, there's no way I was going to dive with that torpedo in the water. We went into the dip, got him on sonar, just in case he dived, and machine gunned his sonars at the same time, so he'd be deaf if he tried to engage any of the ships. At that point, we tried to bring in Plymouth's Wasp, and Endurance's Wasp decided to join in uninvited.
Yeah, it's quite interesting in the diary. This, Chris, you're obviously
wasn't an RAF pilot, was it? By any chance?
No. But one thing that really irritated me, and I'll say it now, I can say it after 40 years, is this desperate attempt to get on the score sheet all the time. And Endurance weren't told to launch; they just got airborne and started shooting up the submarine. It wasn't necessary; it was knackered already. And the only Argentinian injuries occurred. One guy had to have his legs sawn off because of one of these things hitting the fin. It's unnecessary. I feel quite irritated about it. The guy was knackered; he was out of the game, and all the while you've got hooray Henrys from Endurance, trying to, as I say, make a name for themselves. Irritated, I really am. Yeah.
But Chris, the point to make here is that you fired the first shots of the Falklands conflict with these depth charges.
Yeah, of the main conflict, Rob. Yeah, obviously the guys who defended South Georgia and obviously tried to resist in the Falklands on the overnight 1st and 2nd of April, and on the 3rd of April had fired some shots. But I think for the main campaign, that's the case. Yeah.
And you said in the diary that it was the perfect outcome because you had totally disabled the submarine. It managed to hobble into the bay, and everyone got off it and was taken prisoner of war. There were no casualties. And for you as a seaman, you don't like to see other sailors getting killed, and that was the perfect outcome.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I've often thought that had he been a bit deeper and we dropped it as his periscopes basically were breaking surface, on the way down, it probably would have killed the submarine because the pressure would have broken his back.
Yeah.
The very fact we hit him while he was, the hull was basically awash meant that some of the blast was dissipated through the surface and didn't hit him so much. It was quite interesting looking at the submarine afterwards. Every single electronic box in that submarine had sheared off the bulkhead.
Wow.
The port engine was completely knackered. The propeller shaft was bent. As I said, there were 2 split air and fuel tanks aft. And what was really entertaining was they had this big bowl of ravioli that they had in the control room that they were passing around, and this had exploded as well. And there's ravioli all over the dials and instruments. And
without being too modest, how good a shot was it? Your shot to get the depth charge in the right place.
Well, if you have to allow 20 yards of submarine speed for the forward throw.
Mm-hmm.
So he was doing 8 knots. It was 160 yards. The forward throw of 2 depth charges, 164 yards. So he made it really easy for me. He really did. So drop it on top of him. They're going to go in, and basically it went in. One of them hit him and bounced off on the port side, about just after the fin, and the other one went in starboard side, just forward of the fin.
Chris, have you ever had a chance, and I'm forgive me because I've not read your book yet, have you ever had a chance to meet any of the crew or the captain of the submarine subsequent to that incident?
It's a good question. That night we had the captain on board as a prisoner, obviously, and I speak Spanish, so I had to do the interpreting. So we had the captain of Marines. He came up. He was furious, absolutely furious. He'd been delivered by the submarine, and 3 hours later he's a prisoner. So he wasn't very happy at all. But I spoke to Horatio, became the submariner. He was really in shock, obviously. And I said to him, "Look, I'm really sorry about your submarine." He said, "I just can't believe it." I said, I can't believe you attacked me without warning." Oh. And I gave him a sort of look as if to say, "You must be joking." Not only, are you a danger to us, but actually you're a submarine. So you're going to get it. Yeah. It's an observer's dream to catch a submarine.
Yeah.
And there it was. But yeah, he was so shell shocked. And he said in Spanish, "I really screwed up, didn't I?"
Wow.
I said, "Look, I felt like saying to him, look, I spent my time training on Soviet submariners, so, but in fact, I said to him, look, it was an unlucky place to be in, you might not have expected us, obviously, but war is war, isn't it?" What's really interesting, though, I was giving a lecture at the Honourable Artillery Company last November, and the ambassador to Buenos Aires, British ambassador, came up to me and he said, I want to have a word with you. And he said, my son in Buenos Aires used to play football with boys whose fathers had been in the Santa Fe.
Really?
And they said, I want them to say thank you to you for actually, letting them get back in and off the ship.
Mm.
Wow.
Well, do you think there was any fear amongst the crew about going back to the sort of Galtieri regime as failures, if you like?
I spoke to some of them. I didn't detect it. I mean, it's quite interesting. I went to a Welsh college at Oxford, and one of the guys we captured was from Patagonia. He was from the Welsh community there. And he actually was going to go to Oxford the following October. And his sole concern was whether he was going to get his place or not. And I said, no, probably not. We're still at war. So best the war ends, isn't it?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so. The big problem for Argentina throughout the war, I think, was that they really hadn't been in war with anybody before. They'd had some sort of border tussed up with Bolivia, I think, in the 1870s. But, they didn't have the military culture. I mean, one of the things I remember thinking when we went across to the Falklands proper was, we're standing on giant shoulders here. If we mess this up, what would Drake, Nelson, Rodney, all these others think? And the Argentinians didn't have that sort of heritage. And it counts. It's part of the moral component of fighting power that you have that heritage and tradition.
Yeah,
that's really interesting.
And I think it's important.
And just going back to the crashed Wessexes, did anyone ever go back to those? And
yeah, it's a good question. We went back up there when we came back in in May. We went back up there on a really nice day, gin clear day. We went up there to pick up some of the secret stuff and some of the more sensitive munitions that were up there. And of course, surprise, surprise, we're up there and the weather changed. And I must say, there was a real feeling, though, of, do we dare go up there?
Yeah.
It nearly got us the last time, and it might get us this time. A bit of a feeling of that, actually. Yeah. But no, we went up, got the stuff. And in fact, when I went back in York, when I was commanding York in '89, I went up in the links and we had a look. And the two Wessexes were gradually being entombed in the glacier and going down the hill a bit because of the way glaciers operate. I mean, one thing I failed to mention, by the way, is that when we took off finally with the SAS guys, we found that we'd landed on an ice bridge which collapsed underneath us as we took off. And I can honestly say that the inside of glaciers are really deep blue. That wasn't something I was going to share with the guys as we sort of slumped down. I have to tell you, we went down about 10 feet. And I had this sort of vision of the rotors actually contacting with the surface of the glacier. So it had a lot of surprises for us, I can tell you.
Goodness me. You talked about going then over to the Falkland Islands proper, Chris, and it was another first, wasn't it, for Humphrey? Because weren't you part of the first insertion of the main landing forces that then ultimately led to the recovery of the islands?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we had a bit of what we were doing when we were off the Falklands is we were taking SES patrols onto the Falklands in order to, shall we say, discourage Argentinian patrolling. And the Argentinians got wise to this after a while, and the officers decided they weren't going to patrol with their men. They'd let the lads go out and do it. And the upshot of that was, of course, the lads would walk about 100 yards down the road, sit under a hedge or a wall, and radio in that they were 5 miles away or 8 miles away, nothing happening. So great, the officers staying in the nice and warm. But there was a problem with an Argentinian company on Fanning Head, which was at the entrance to San Carlos. They had a recallless rifle or two, and they were going to be a problem. And so Antrim, the ship, and Humphrey, the helicopter, had to take the SBS in. And the idea was that the SBS would go in, surround the company. Antrim would use its 4.5-inch guns to shoot naval gunfire support at these guys. As the guys ran away, the SBS would kill them. That was the plan. And so we embarked another Wessex on the back in addition to our own. And there's a picture of it sitting in the starboard side lane. Never happened before. And essentially we had to go in, weather not great again, thick fog, and again at night, no night vision goggles, navigating by stopwatch and with inertial navigation, basically. And I also had to control by radar the Wessex 5 in with his chaps.
And there were times when you were actually quite separate from each other, and you were having to navigate Ian, Stanley, and Humphrey, and the Wessex 5, which was also some miles away from you.
Yeah, I had to navigate him in. So the first thing we did was put a Bardic T down, which is a sort of essentially a T-shaped landing light arrangement. So we had to do that. And you're right, Rob, I had to control the Wessex 5 in by radar, almost doing a ground-controlled approach while I was flying myself. That's something that you're trained to do, by the way. But the conditions were pretty marginal. And on the last time, it was a bit ungrateful of the Argentinians. We actually got shot at. So that added to it all. But it worked. We got the guys on the ground, and Antrim fired about 50 rounds. The Argentinians scattered. The SBS swept them up, and we were able to get the amphibs into San Carlos. I mean, let me tell you what happened at the start of that, because it was both humorous and naive. They decided they wanted these Argentinians to surrender rather than get killed. Mm-hmm. So they kitted this marine up with a yoke system with 2 speakers they'd taken from one of the mess decks. They hooked it up to a megaphone that a major called Rod Bell was going to use. And he'd grown up in Costa Rica, so he spoke Spanish. And the idea was that he was going to say in Spanish, you're surrounded, you need to surrender. Right, you could see the Marine with the 2 speakers wasn't impressed with this at all. And surprise, surprise, as soon as Rob Bell went, do you want to surrender? He was met with a sort of blast of automatic fire. So that failed at the first presentation. So, yeah, what a great idea that was.
And Chris, while Antrim was in, I think, in that area of the Falklands, Antrim actually got hit.
Yeah, well, we were the air defence coordinator for the first day in San Carlos. Now, we were out in Falkland Sound between the 2 islands. All the warships were. And Admiral would have said to you that it was deliberate, to tempt the Argentinians to attack us. It wasn't that at all. We were stationed there because we were doing anti-submarine warfare as well. We didn't know where one of the other submarines was, so we had to do that. The long and the short of it was we had about 70 raids that day.
Cool.
We got attacked by some Mirage, shot up the ship. The aircraft itself got punctured with over 100 sort of splinter holes. It had fuel pissing out the back.
One of my Humphrey, this is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of my maintainers was blinded, unfortunately, to this day, still blind. And Ian got injured, and my air crewman got shrapnel all over his legs. And one bit hit him right in the gusset between the legs.
Oh.
And he was lying on the flight deck saying, "They've got me nuts. They've got me nuts." And I said, "Fitz, they haven't got your nuts. It might hurt, but, do your teeth hurt?" Because I remember reading in Gerald of Wales, if you get castrated, your teeth hurt.
Really? Is that the first thing that hurts?
I remembered that. Okay, your teeth hurt.
Yeah.
So that's obviously the advantage of being a historian. So I said, "You're okay. You're fine, Fitz." It's great. No, they got me nuts. They got me nuts. Well, he had some injuries, but his nuts were okay. But your poor old aircraft, had about 100 holes in it. All the looming had gone, and also looked pretty sad actually. And I have to say, the Matsu unit, the aircraft repair unit that had come down in one of the repair ships, Stena Sea Spread, got the aircraft flying with the flight again within 5 days.
Brilliant.
Wow.
Absolutely brilliant. They sealed all the tanks, they repaired the looming, and you couldn't do that today.
No.
You just don't have the skills, but it was brilliant. And we were flying again within 5 days. And check test flight was interesting. But no, it was great. And so that happened. But in the course of one of the Mirage attacks, we got a bomb that went in the only angle I think it could have gone in between the Sea Slug launcher and the magazine flash doors. Now, if it had gone in the magazine or hit one of the missiles, we'd have been vaporized because we had 38 missiles in that magazine. And these missiles, the Sea Slug, were actually mini V2 rockets with wraparound boosters. And they went Mark II, and they were a really good missile, actually, against, sort of 707s and high-flying Russian aircraft like Bears or Badgers, but they weren't great, obviously low level. We used to use them as bird scarers. If we saw a formation coming in, we used to fire it down the bearing. And mostly these aircraft would go and do somebody else rather than us. So it worked. It was, we called it the gash mode. Give RGs the shits mode.
Right, okay.
And I have to say, one of them landed ashore and just completely demolished the top of a mountain. I mean, it was great. We had this plan for taking out Argentinian observation positions if we found any. You could just use the missile to do it. But anyway, we caught this 1,000-pound bomb, British made. It went through 8 bulkheads and landed in the afterheads, which is the toilets. I've got a picture of it sitting between two of the traps.
No one on them at the time, I really hope.
I don't know, not at action stations.
No.
So a bit of a problem. And this thing stayed with us all day while we had the rest of the air raids. Cradled basically by lots of mattresses and sandbags and 2 sailors who really weren't told the implications of babysitting this thing. But at the end of the day, we had a really remarkable feat of engineering. We cut through the decks, including the flight deck, to get at the thing. We put some shear legs at the top and a pulley system, and 2 EOD guys bravely put it into a cradle. We brought it up onto the flight deck, took it down to the quarter deck, put it over the side. And 15 minutes later, we got a signal from Sink Fleet saying, on no account, move the bomb.
Brilliant. Which had been made in Derby. Is that right? You went and looked at it, didn't you?
The nameplate was Derby, yeah. And that's fine. I mean, they were delivering, bombs to us from Britain. We were eating corned beef sandwiches from Argentina.
Yeah, that's true.
Seems like fairness.
Yeah, bizarre, isn't it? So the Argentine surrender then came on the 14th of June, and eventually you had to stick around for a little bit, I think, before you could head home. But what was the journey home like, and what was it like when you finally arrived back in Portsmouth?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite interesting because it's a long way back. And so all of us had sort of charts indicating, the line where we were going back up again. And I did some watchkeeping on the bridge because I'm obviously a career seaman officer. People generally sort of got suntans. I mean, the commander, the second in command, said, look, we've got to go back looking pretty shipshape. So there's a lot of maintenance and cleanliness routines, things like that. Catching up with the mail. Doing the sort of things you normally do in peacetime.
How many had you lost from Antrim? Personnel?
Well, we've lost about 28 injured. When we got strafed, we got some people injured. They all recovered. I mean, the worst one was Terry Bullingham with his blindness. Mm-hmm. The Royal Marine Sergeant Major lost a kidney, I think. Others got sort of broken bones. We had a 30mm rocket attack as well. That caused some casualties on the upper deck. We were very lucky. We didn't lose anybody dead.
Yeah.
And so, we came back and Antrim had a good war. We did all sorts of other things that were fairly useful. I think the most remarkable thing in those days was the ability of the Navy to get its kit, both the ships and the aircraft, back in the fight again.
Yeah.
People had real sort of hand skills that you don't have now.
No.
Yeah. It's that's what we've lost, I think.
Yeah.
You couldn't imagine. You couldn't get Humphrey back together again like that nowadays.
No, he's back. He's in a museum now in Yeovilton, isn't he?
Yeah, he's in Yeovilton. It disappointed me because we delivered the aircraft to Yeovilton in a complete working state. You could have flown it. Yeah. And what was disappointing is over the next couple of years, they robbed Humphrey of stores to put in Sea Kings.
Oh.
Real Philistines. I'm going to start a campaign soon, I think, putting Humphrey back together again.
Oh, I like that. That.
Because there's enough Wessex 3 stuff around to be able to redo it. In fact, there's a Wessex 3 at HMS Sultan that poses as Humphrey on Navy days.
Well, we can't have that.
No.
Right.
So I'm going to try and get the kit out of Humphrey. It was used for a TV documentary into real Humphrey.
Brilliant.
But I'm giving a presentation with Ian and Stuart on Friday night at the Fleet Aero Museum in front of Humphrey.
Oh, super!
Which is the 40th anniversary, of course, of getting the SAS off the Glacier.
Yeah. In your diary, you write a few lessons learned during your time out there, and there's some really interesting ones. One of the points you make is how much you missed Ark Royal and what the old Fairy Gannets would have given you, which would have been airborne early warning right there and then, which you just did not have.
But you see, that was because one of the prevailing assumptions at the early 80s amongst my olders and betters was that we would never ever have to fight. A number of things we wouldn't fight. We'd never do an amphibious landing against an opposed shore. Mm-hmm. We'd never operate outside the NATO area without Allied (US) support, and we'd never operate anywhere without the RAF. Well, that worked out, didn't it?
Yeah, I won't ask you for your thoughts on the RAF contribution.
No, I'm okay with the RAF. I'm a member of the RAF club.
Indeed.
It's great.
Good to see.
Well done. But Chris, so arrival back in Portsmouth, Alison was there to meet you along with Uncle Tony, my godfather, Tony, grandson, and the whole family were there. And that was quite a moment, I guess, because you've been at sea for well over 100 days by this stage.
What are you trying to say?
Well,
No, it's fine. I mean, it's quite interesting. We came back and obviously you do Procedure Alpha where you man the upper deck. And we came in. It was a July day. I think it was a Saturday, and I just couldn't believe how many people there were there. Yeah. I mean, unbelievable numbers of people, tens of thousands of people. Yeah. And we thought, well, somebody else must be coming in behind us, Hermes or something like that. Yeah. But in fact, they were all there to greet us. And one of the things I'm always very proud about is that when our ships have been to war. Portsmouth and Plymouth both know how to bring their ships home.
Yeah.
And I'll confess to you guys, it's probably the only time I've nearly welled up as an adult.
Really?
It's really emotional.
You should meet Jez. He does it every week.
Most things.
No, seriously, it's very emotional, And but yeah, it's and what really rotted me up was that Alison said to me, "Oh, you are coming home tonight, aren't you?" And I said, "Well, I rather want to fly the aircraft back to Portland tomorrow with Ian." And so she went to my captain and said, "Can you order Chris to come home with me tonight?" And he ordered me to go home with my wife.
Oh, yeah. Oh, dear.
And I wanted to go home with my aircraft.
Yeah. Oh, dear. That tricky moment. So Alison won.
Let's call it a draw. I got her back.
But Chris, other lessons learned. I mean, what was the thinking about how the British forces dealt with the whole conflict, and what we might have learned since then in terms of the current strength of our armed forces and so on?
I think it's fair to say, and I say it in the book, that the Falklands saved the Royal Navy. If the Knot Review had gone through from 1981, we'd have ended up with submarines, Nimrods, and anti-submarine forces, and nothing else. We'd lost the carriers, the amphibious forces, probably the Marines as well.
Yeah.
So the Navy that we have today is a direct descendant of what went to the Falklands. And if you think about it, what has happened is we've mutated from being predominantly a North Atlantic Norwegian sea force, Greenland, Iceland, UK, Faroes Gap, into being a global Britain naval force. And that transition couldn't have happened without this idea that somehow we need to go 8,000 miles to go and do something by sea. We're in a maritime era again for the United Kingdom. The army, frankly, doesn't know what it's for. It doesn't know whether it's supposed to do high-end war fighting or sort of peace support or high impact, low footprint. Until it sorts itself out, it's got no right to say how many soldiers it should have. And I think the future belongs to what I call high impact, low footprint forces. And that privileges air and maritime, frankly. And if the army wants to look for a role, it needs to look at what the Royal Marines are doing, frankly. Highly enabled, high impact forces that have a light footprint. And that's the future. If you look at Ukraine today, Ukraine's a 20th century war. And this is what people are missing. Every component of that, apart from the use of open source intelligence and some cyber, there's not a lot of cyber, is a 20th century war. And we've got to configure ourselves today for 21st century wars. And that involves engaging the whole of society. You've seen the economic aspects. You've seen the attack on utilities and on infrastructure in Ukraine. Every time a Russian submarine with cruise missiles is within range of the United Kingdom, we need to start paying attention. Not just ballistic nuclear submarines. That's where it's changing today. And as I keep saying to people, the sea is the physical equivalent of the World Wide Web. Everything that goes virtually on the web, really goes by sea.
Yes.
Over it, under it, or across it. And unless we realize that is actually the engine of globalization, and if we lose control of the sea to China or Russia or both of them, we ain't doing global Britain. We're not actually going to thrive. And so, the Ukraine war is the last of the continental wars, I think, in the traditional sense. You're gonna have, as I said, high impact, low footprint forces. And I do believe in future, the question is going to be, how few boots do you put on the ground?
We're not going to see a return to the British Army of the Rhine anytime soon.
No, you're not. British Army of nowhere. It's you basically. Let me put something to you. In the Second World War, if you wanted to destroy the building you're in, it would have taken nearly 240,000 pounds of bombs, because you can't do it. You can put a precision weapon with 10-pound warhead through that window behind you. We've got to do the same with boots on the ground and say, how few precision-guided boots on the ground do we need to actually achieve objectives? Simple as that. It's the most expensive component that we deploy is the human beings.
As what we'd consider a military expert, I know we're starting going a little bit off the topic here. How surprised are you at the moment with the way the Russians are operating in Ukraine?
I'm not surprised because I know what their doctrine is, and I know the state of some of their equipment and their training and collective performance. So I'm not surprised. If you send armour in against anti-armour without infantry, you're going to get your armour pasted. It's as simple as that. If you don't get control of the air, and frankly the Russians haven't got control of the air, you're not going to be able to put your aircraft in positions where they can do ground attack and all sorts of other things. Essentially, the good old Ukrainians had a good look at Russian doctrine and practice and said, right, yeah, we'll counter that, and this is how we're going to do it. But don't underestimate how big the Ukrainian army is. It's the biggest army in Europe. So their fielded forces are actually quite substantial as well. And so they've also got the biggest air force on paper. So they're not insubstantial in their own right. The basic problem for the Russians is that they did the classic thing. They underestimated their opponent because they thought 2014, that was easy. We'll do it again. They also didn't look at the topography. You look at the north of Ukraine, it's heavily forested. You've got mixed forest and steppe in the middle. And in the south, you've got steppe country, which is good tank country. Well, there's no surprise that the Russians have done quite well in the south. And people are missing this at the moment. But if you look at essentially the collective training, the corruption, the thing that really did for them, I think, guys, is sitting on the ground in the cold and wet for the best part of 8 weeks before they went in. I mean, I've been reading on Russian Twitter. I speak Russian. I've been reading on Russian Twitter that the Russian soldiers were so cold they were sort of stealing radiators and hooking them up to the batteries in their tanks. And so when it came to start the tanks, they didn't start. So, I mean, it's, it's just simple things like that. And I think hanging around for 8 weeks and not expecting to go in, by the way, I think that decision was made over a very short period by Putin and his FSB buddies who seem to direct the strategy of the campaign. If you look at Gerasimov and Shoigu's faces the day they were told they were going in, that even by Russian standards, they were looking pretty good.
That's really interesting. Oh, Chris, well, look, in terms of Humphrey, we'll do our bit in terms of the campaign to get him back to his full strength again. But thank you so much for joining us. It's really good to hear from you, and great to see you again after all this time. Who'd have thought?
Great pleasure, guys. Keep up the good work.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Chris. Fascinating stuff.
Absolutely brilliant.
Thanks ever so much.
Cheers.
Good night.
Cheers, Chris. Bye. We are enormously grateful to Chris Parry for giving up his time to talk to us at such length. He's a man very much in demand in the media, particularly these days, so a huge thanks to him for joining us. His book, Down South, his daily diary of his involvement in the Falklands, is a must-read and is available from all the usual outlets. I can thoroughly recommend it. Do keep an eye out for our next podcast for more fascinating aviation history, when our guest will be Ian Whittle, son of Sir Frank Whittle, inventor of the jet engine. You can find all our podcasts on our website, toplandinggear.com, or wherever you normally get your podcasts from. And it would be great for us if you could subscribe. It is, of course, completely free. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.